Please go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me just get that up and running. Okay, I hope everybody could see that. Good evening. As Jamil pointed out, my name is Greg Galletti, and I have the pleasure of discussing with you tonight the history of the League of Nations as it's represented through philatelic memorabilia and ephemeral material. So why are we talking about the League of Nations now? Well, in 2020, the League of Nations would have been 100 years old if it had existed up until this point in time. So what we'd like to do is just kind of give you a timeline on the history of the organization. And as we go through the timeline, in the early years, obviously there was the birth of the League of Nations and the development of the organization. There was some movement of the League to Geneva, which became its permanent home. And then we'll discuss some of the initial meetings and the start of postal operations. And then the intervening years, we're going to discuss some of the activities of the League of Nations and its semi-autonomous organizations, the International Labor Organization and the Permanent Court of International Justice. Then we'll transition and look at some of the activities of the League as represented through postal history. The Refugee Commission, the mandate system, and some of the early conferences that were performed by the League of Nations. And then we will cover the years 1930 to 1939. And again, we'll look at some of the major activities of the organization during that period. Disarmament, economics, health and hygiene, conflict and control, which was a main function of the League, and the onset of World War II and how it affected the League of Nations. And then finally, in the last 6 or so years of the League's existence, we'll look at how the League survived during World War II, the initial creation of the United Nations as a result of the World War, and then the transition between the League of Nations and the United Nations. And finally, we'll talk about the end of the League of Nations. Okay, to start, the League of Nations got its birth at the Paris Peace Conferences in 1919 at the close of World War I. And as many of you know, the peace conferences in Paris actually were several conferences going on simultaneously. The main one that really was the first time the League of Nations had its birth was at the Treaty of Versailles. And that was the treaty that was between Germany and the winning powers, if you will, Great Britain and mainly France. Now, in the Treaty of Versailles itself, there is the Covenant of the League of Nations, which was adopted at the signing of Versailles. And during the conference, the French Postal Administration made available to collectors and just for use of the delegates, various cancellations associated with the conference. So as a collector of this area, what we would typically look for are the various circular date stamps for the conference. You'll notice that there's some blue rubber stamps. Those are typically of the delegations. And again, they're very collectible, so we will be looking for things associated with each of the delegations that were part of the Paris Peace Conference. And then there are certain cancellations by each of the delegations and conference stationery that's important for collecting. So if you look at the upper left-hand cover, the first cover there, you'll notice it says Versailles Chateau, Congrès de Peace. And that circular date stamp was used during the Versailles Conference. And there's a Frieden's Delegation rubber stamp here, I believe, for Germany. Next to it, there is a free franked cover from the Italian delegation. Below, there is a additional cover from the German peace delegation, and there is a special German cancellation associated with the delegation. And finally, you'll notice on the bottom right, there's a small envelope that has a pre-printed corner card from the Secretary General of the conference. And there is a different type of circular date stamp for that particular usage. You'll notice it doesn't say Chateau, it simply says Versailles on the top. So as a collector, what we would be looking for are cancellations, auxiliary markings, and stationery, which might indicate the origins of these conferences and what was going on. Importantly also, as we go through this presentation, it's often important to look at the addressee of the envelope, because there's a lot of interesting historical information that you might be able to gain simply by looking at who this was addressed to, doing some research, and finding out the importance of that addressee. Okay, after the Treaty of Versailles was signed and the League of Nations was adopted, the first Secretary General was a British citizen. He was a member of the Foreign Service, and his name was Sir Eric Drummond. When the League first started, the first temporary home for the organization was actually in London. And they were there from 1919 to the early parts of 1920 at central buildings in Westminster. Now, we know there are no special cancellations or stamps issued by the British PTT for the League of Nations. And as a matter of fact, what you see here is the only known cover from that period of time when the League was in London. And the cover and the enclosed letter signed by Sir Eric Drummond was sent to an individual in New York who happened to be a collector of autographs. In addition, I think the reason he probably got a response is because his uncle was actually a delegate at Versailles and was an acquaintance of Sir Eric Drummond. Now you'll notice the picture above, that's one of the early conferences, and I happen to highlight Eric Drummond there in the photograph. Early in 1920, the League of Nations was moved to its permanent home in Geneva, Switzerland. Initially, the League was in the Hotel National, which is on the shores of Lake Geneva. The postcard in the upper left is a photograph of the Hotel National. And the League of Nations actually was there for many years, approximately 16 years. They worked out of the Hotel National. After Woodrow Wilson's death in the early 1920s, the hotel was renamed in his honor. In the upper right-hand corner, we see another photograph, and this is the premiere or the first session of the League of Nations Council. And you can think of the League Council similar to the United Nations Security Council. It's made up of just a certain few members of the League of Nations, and typically those were the most powerful members of the League. Below, you will see a postcard that shows the Palais De Nacion, which was the permanent home of the League of Nations in Geneva. Now, this beautiful building was actually designed by a consortium of architects. There was actually a competition that was started to try to come up with a design. And in reviewing the designs, they couldn't actually pick a winner. So what they decided to do is group about 4 or 5 of the architects that had very good submittals, and they actually made them work together as if you will, a union, as a League of Nations, to come up with the design of the actual building. Now, the building itself resides in the Ariana Park, which is right along the shores of Lake Geneva, and it was donated to the League of Nations by a very wealthy landowner. In the upper right-hand corner of the postcard, you'll notice a small building, and that's actually the Ariana Museum. And that museum is known for its world-class collection of ceramics. So let's talk a little bit about the early postal operations. The League of Nations, when they were in the Palais Wilson, they didn't have any stamps specific to the organization. In the very early years, they used just basic Swiss definitive issues that were available through the Swiss PTT. But in early 1920, the Swiss PTT did provide the League of Nations a special circular date stamp. And that circular date stamp you'll see here, it's Geneva 1, Société de Nation. And that date stamp started in November of 1920 and went through, I believe, March of 1927. And at that time, the Postal Administration changed slightly, so it became Geneva 10, Société de Nacion. Interesting enough, as I mentioned before, it's always interesting to know who the addressee is. In this case, this gentleman, Iba Beef, you'll actually see his name quite often on very early League of Nations correspondence. And a little research indicates that he actually was a prominent book dealer in Geneva. And it was thanks to him that a lot of the earliest League of Nations postal history still exists. In the upper right-hand corner, we see a nice postcard of the League of Nations mail delivery. And this postcard actually came out of a series. The League had, I think, 8 or 10 series of cards that they offered to visitors. And each of those packets of cards, there was probably a dozen to 20 cards in each packet. One of the first series, either series 1 or series 2, happened to have this postcard, and I thought it would be appropriate to show that. So you could see even early on, I mean, a horse-drawn carriage, early on, the League of Nations was receiving hordes and hordes of mail. So postal operations were vital to the new organization. In the lower right-hand corner, you'll see this nice legal size envelope. And again, this particular cover does not bear a overprinted stamp, because at the time this cover was actually put in the mail stream, the League of Nations still did not have its own overprinted issues. So one of the things that we look for, well, how do we know this is a League of Nations cover? Well, again, because of the circular date stamp, which would indicate it's a League of Nations item. And also, if you notice in the left-hand side, there's a very faint rubber stamp, a circular rubber stamp that says League of Nations, Geneva, Switzerland. And that League of Nations rubber stamp is what we call an origin cachet. And that's one of the areas that League of Nations collectors actually look for, because there's quite a few origin cachets. And when we show you a few later, I'll indicate why they exist. In this case, this origin cachet was used sort of as a corner card for the envelope to show the origin. In addition, you'll notice there's a registry label here. And again, the Swiss PTT made available to the League of Nations special registry labels that would have Société de Nacion printed on them. Now, the postal operations for the League of Nations and also for the International Labor Organization, it's a very interesting story. I had an opportunity to review some of the documents in the League of Nations archives related to the development of the Postal Administration. And Sir Eric Drummond, who I mentioned was the Secretary General of the League of Nations, was a very pragmatic individual. And his correspondence between himself, Sir Albert Thomas, who was the Director General of the International Labor Organization, and the Swiss PTT, basically centered around, trying to establish stamps that would either be free or reduced price for the League of Nations. The reason being, he wanted to save as much money as possible, and he recognized there was going to be a tremendous amount of mail emanating from the organization, and he was really concerned about the budget. On the other hand, Sir Albert Thomas with the ILO was much more interested in promoting the organization. So most of the correspondence between he and the Swiss PTT centered around producing stamps that were unique designs specific for the organizations. This went on for several months, and ultimately, as we'll see on the next slide, neither gentleman really got what they wanted. The Swiss did not issue special unique stamps for the organizations. They took regular Swiss stamps in circulation, and they applied overprints for the League and the ILO. In addition, they didn't actually provide any discounted postage for use by the organizations. Now, one interesting fact early on was that the UPU rates in early 1921 increased from 20 centimes to 40 centimes. And it led to a very unusual situation where certain League of Nations mail was actually hand carried to the League of Nations information office in Paris. And it was franked with French stamps and then canceled and put in the mail stream. Because at the time, the French postage for that same UPU rate was less than what was going on in Geneva at the time. Now, there's not very many covers of this that we have found, but it's something you should certainly look for if you're going through dealer stocks. Try to find League of Nations covers from the early 1920s, 21, maybe part of 22, that actually have these French stamps and are canceled in Paris. So in May of 1922, the Swiss PTT did provide, finally, the League of Nations, a small supply of overprinted stamps. And they were typically the smaller denominations up to the 1 franc issue. And they were provided to them specifically for and limited to official use only. They were not to be sold to the public. They were not to be used for personnel mail. They were only to be used for official usage. So here are examples of the stamps. So for the League of Nations, the original overprint was a 3-line overprint, Société de Nacion, and you see it there in the 5 centime and the 25 centime stamp. And again, they used typical denominations that they had available. This is the Tell Boy issues and the bust of William Tell that are very common. And then for this example, for the ILO, it actually says SDN, Société de Nacion, Bureau International du Travail, for the International Labor Organization. Now, the way they got these overprints on the stamps was they took the panes of stamps and they actually had cliches of the overprint set up in a printing press, and they would apply those cliches either in groups of 50, as you see here for the lower, smaller denominations, or in groups of 25 for the larger denominations, such as this 30 centime picture of the League headquarters. So let's go on to the assemblies. Like the United Nations, the League of Nations had a General Assembly, and that General Assembly was made up of the member states, the member nations, each had representatives. If you look in the upper right-hand corner, you'll see this was a photograph of the plenary session of the first General Assembly. And you can see how large a crowd assembled for this monumental meeting. Now, during the meeting, the Swiss PTT made available to the individuals that were at the conference special cancellations. And for the first assembly, we know that 2 different rectangular cancellations exist. One saying Geneva Assemble, ending with the L, and the other one saying Geneva Assemblée with 2 E's. Now, those are the only 2 cancellations that we know of specific for the first assembly. Now, in addition to the cancellations, the Swiss PTT also made available registry labels. And if you look closely at the lower cover, that registry label actually has a rubber overprint applied to it that says Geneva Assembly. So for that first assembly, there was also special registry labels available. For the second General Assembly, there was only one particular cancel available, and it's shown here in the lower right-hand corner, Geneva ASS.SDN. We consider these rectangular cancels, they're pretty scarce. I mean, you can find them on a rare occasion through auction catalogs, but there are very few that have survived over the time. So let's transition and talk a little bit about the ILO. So the International Labor Organization was actually a semi-autonomous organization within the League of Nations. And again, it got its birth through the covenant of the League of Nations at the Versailles Conference as well. So the first headquarters of the ILO, which is shown in this photograph in the upper left-hand corner, is a building that resides just downstream of the League headquarters, and it sits very close to the shores of Lake Geneva. Now, like the League of Nations, originally the ILO didn't have any specially overprinted stamps. So the ILO would use just normal Swiss issues, And unlike the League of Nations, the Swiss PTD did not make a special circular date stamp for the ILO in the early years. Hence, all the materials on all the mail from the ILO was put in the Geneva mail stream, and they typically bore Geneva machine cancels or hand cancels from the local post office. Now, the very early covers for the League of Nations, for the ILO, I should say, if you look at the cover in the upper right-hand corner, Société de Nations, League of Nations, on the top corner card is very prominent. And down below, the Bureau International du Travail is kind of secondary. And it showed that they were sort of the secondary cousin to the League at that time. Well, after some discussion, subsequently, you'll see in the later years, starting in 1923, Thomas made some that his issues well known to the Swiss PTT, and they ended up agreeing with having this stationery reversed, if you will. So the ILO was now the main corner card, and the League of Nations was now subject to the lower area. So like the League, in March of 1923, about a year after the League got its overprinted stamps, the ILO also received the overprinted stamps from the Swiss PTT. And again, if you look at this particular cover, it is franked with a 30 centime definitive issue, and it's tied to the cover by a typical Geneva circular date stamp, not specific to the ILO. And again, if you look at the registry label, there is no indication on this early registry label that it has anything to do with the ILO itself. In addition to normal stationery, the ILO would have international conferences on an annual basis. And again, there would be special stationery was issued for these conferences. You'll notice in this case, there is a registry label that has a special violet rubber stamp imprint on it, indicative of the conference. And if you look, the circular date stamp now for the conference actually is indicative that it is for the ILO conference itself. And that circular date stamp started in the early 1920s, and it continued through probably the 1950s before there was some slight modifications to the typeface. Now, the Permanent Court of International Justice was also a semi-autonomous organization of the League. It got its birth, like the ILO, in the Treaty of Versailles, in the Covenant of the League. And the headquarters for the Permanent Court of International Justice was set up in The Hague, Netherlands. And if you look, we have two covers here representing the Permanent Court, both having corner cards indicative of the PCIJ. The upper cover, you'll notice, has a nice definitive issue from the Netherlands, and it is tied by a Gravenhagen circular date stamp that was used by the Permanent Court. Now, that upper stamp was just a normal Dutch issue. There's nothing indicative about that issue to say it was from the Court of Justice. Now, in 1934, the Dutch actually produced stamps for the Court of Justice. And if you look at the lower right-hand corner stamp, you'll see that there is an overprint on that stamp. And the overprint is in dark gold, and it's the words that I have written on the bottom of the text. In addition, you'll notice the CPJI Officio Auxiliary mark here, which again, it was used as a dispatch mark for the court. So let's talk a little bit about some of the activities of the League. The Refugee Commission was founded and started at the first assembly. And the first High Commissioner for the refugee organization was Fridtjof Nansen, who was a famous Norwegian polar explorer. And after World War I, there were a lot of refugees that needed to be repatriated with their countries. And Nansen set out to try to develop a process to do just that, to repatriate people. So what do we know about the Refugee Commission from a postal history point of view? Well, if you look at the upper left-hand corner, we have a nice little cover from the League of Nations to this gentleman Zwerner, who was in the High Commission for Refugees in Salonika. So again, it's always important to look to see where these covers are going because it may indicate something. Zwerner actually started out with the Red Cross. He moved into the High Commission for Refugees, and he spent many, many years as a member of the High Commission for Refugees. If you look at the cover on the upper right-hand corner, you'll notice a very nice label that's been attached to the cover that talks about the International Bureau of Labor. So why is that? Well, around 1925, the Refugee Commission actually went to the League and said, hey, most of the problems with repatriating refugees deals with work and having availability of jobs, and they petitioned to have the ILO actually administer the Refugee Commission for a period of time. So between about 1925 and I think 1928 or 29, the ILO was actually dealing with and managing the refugee situation within the League of Nations. And then finally, the cover on the bottom, you'll notice it no longer talks about refugees, but it says the International Nansen Refugee Organization. And the reason for that was after Nansen's death, the League of Nations, in his honor, renamed the organization in his name. After 1938, when the war was just about to start, the Nansen organization was relocated to London. This is a Nansen passport. So one of the things that Nansen had set up was to try to develop this passport system. And you'll notice there's a 5 gold franc stamp in there. And these stamps were printed by the Nansen Refugee Organization, and they were affixed to these passports. And the refugee would either pay the 5 franc fee if they could afford it, and if they couldn't afford it, it was paid for them by the refugee organization. Now, there are many, many of these stamps. They vary in text and in dates and in design, and I'm not going to get into the details of that, but that would make a wonderful collection if you're looking at like revenues or that type of collecting area. So the League also had a mandate system, and after World War I, basically the former German and Turkish colonies were put into a mandate system, and they were governed typically by Great Britain and France. And those mandates, there were 3 different categories of mandates, and those categories were based on the autonomy of the area, their ability to self-govern, their ability to basically self-rule. So from the perspective of postal history, there are several things we look for. One is this little origin cachet up there that says mandat. And that origin cachet would be applied by the section of the League whenever they were dispatching mail. And the reason they did that is they used these cachets, these origin cachets, as a way to monitor how much mail was going out from each section of the League of Nations. So it was really used as an accounting system. In the lower left-hand corner, we have a nice cover with a pre-printed corner card from the Republic of France, and this corner card is for one of the mandate colonies that France was basically in charge of. And then finally, in the lower right-hand corner, we have a nice League of Nations airmail cover. And again, the importance of this cover really goes to where it was going. And it was going to Syria, to the Council of Trustees. You'll also notice that there is a second, there's a square rubber stamp here, an origin cachet, and that's from the Secretary General's office. So League-related conferences. Now, the League had many conferences that they sponsored, and they also had conferences that they promoted, but they didn't actually sponsor. And as a collector of League-related items, these sorts of conference would be of interest to us. Most of the conferences had special date stamps or commemorative cancels to indicate that the conference actually had occurred. So here's just 2 examples, early examples. This one from Spa, Belgium in 1920. And then there's 2 different examples from the Genoa Economic Conference in 1922. In addition to conferences, the council, as we mentioned, it was similar to the United Nations Security Council, would meet sometimes outside of Geneva. Often when they met outside of Geneva, the host country would produce either a commemorative date stamp, or in some rare instances would actually overprint their local stamps to commemorate the council meetings. So here's a couple different examples. This one in the upper area of the page is from the Rome session, 32nd session, and you can see this is in Italian for the League of Nations. In the lower left-hand corner, we have a beautiful registered car cover that was going from the Madrid conference to Geneva. If you notice, these stamps all are overprinted and that overprint was special for the League of Nations conference. And the rectangular date stamp you see here also was special for the conference. And that particular rectangular cancel was only used typically on registered mail. And then finally, we have a nice little postcard that has two different circular cancellations honoring the Lugano conference, the 53rd session. So let's kind of transition to some of the activities of the League. One of the big things the League was involved with was disarmament and trying to get arms agreements between the member states. So it really, in essence, to try to avoid a war like World War I. And in 1932, the League did convene a general disarmament conference in Geneva. And how do we know the existence of that conference? Well, there's two different ways really to look at that. There's corner cards like this one here from the delegation of the United States to the disarmament conference. And we also have circular date stamps, a special commemorative circular date stamp that the Swiss PTT made available to people that were at the conference. And again, if you look, there was also a registry label with a hand imprinted conference overprint. Okay. In addition, I don't have it shown here, but there are origin cachets for disarm, and they would be typically in that rectangular box with the letters disarm in there, and that was from the disarmament section of the League of Nations that was working on disarmament issues. Economy and monetary. Again, the League of Nations after World War I, a lot of the countries were suffering with economic concerns. And one of the areas that the League of Nations tried to focus on was economies and monetary stability. So several conferences were convened to deal with these issues. And the one I'm showing here is from the London in 1933. And again, the League of Nations made available special stationery for that conference. This happens to be an oval date stamp that's indicative for that conference. On the right-hand side, we have a special commemorative cancel that was made available by the British PTT for the use of the members at the conference. And then down below, there is an additional circular date stamp, a much smaller one, that was specific for registered mail. And you'll notice again, the registry label in this instance was pre-printed to show that it was for use at the Monetary and Economic Conference. Now, the postcard in the lower left is actually a precursor to this economic conference, and it was a conference in Geneva that the League of Nations convened as a preparatory meeting for that later economic conference in 1933. What's interesting about this postcard, two things. One, you'll notice there's a circular date stamp here that says Geneva Special. And that is special because they use that circular date stamp for extraordinary meetings of the League of Nations, and so they're very infrequently seen. In addition, you notice the normal registry label, but again, there's a special overprint that was indicative of the special nature of this particular meeting. Let's transition to another area that the League was heavily involved in, and that was health and hygiene. And this is one of my favorite areas for League history. And after the war, there was a lot of famine and disease and epidemics that were going on primarily in Southeast Asia and the Asian areas. And so the League of Nations developed a bureau outside of Singapore to try to track and disseminate information on the situation with diseases and epidemics that were raging at the time. So here's a nice cover. It's a censored cover, and it's got the pre-printed corner card for that Eastern Bureau. And C.L. Park was the director of that bureau. In the upper right-hand corner, we have a nice cover that was sent to the Opium Board in Washington, D.C. And this gentleman, Renborg, some might recognize him because he worked for the League of Nations, but when the United Nations got its start, he transitioned to the United Nations, and he actually became the first postmaster of the United Nations Postal Administration. On that particular cover, you'll notice there's again an origin cachet that says EPID for Epidemiology section of the League. And the lower cover, again, it was addressed to Renborg while he was in Washington. In this case, there's a rectangular origin cachet for OP, which stood for the Opium Board of the League of Nations. And finally, in 1937, the League of Nations held a special conference for, unfortunately, for trafficking of women and children in Indonesia. And the Indonesian Salvation Army created this nice souvenir cachet. These special stamps were issued, and this special commemorative cancel was applied. The registry label is also important for this particular cover because the two different types exist. One is in green, which is common. A second registry label would be in red, and if you can find that, it's quite uncommon. And finally, there's a nice pre-printed postal card here that was the reason I put this up there. The League of Nations Publication Department often promoted the publications of the health and hygiene organizations. So whenever they came up with reports related to health and hygiene, they would disseminate these to libraries and other organizations that might have need for those reports and that information. In this case, I thought it was really interesting that this went to the reclamation area for the tsetse in Uganda, Africa. One of the biggest things that the League of Nations did is they had to deal with conflict and control. And one of the main premises of the League of Nations was to have a collective security. And so whenever there was some issues that would come up, the League of Nations would try to get involved to basically deal with the issues, settle them without the disputes leading to any armed conflict. So after World War I, the Saar territory between Germany and France was actually administered for 15 years by the League of Nations. There was actually a commission set up. And after that 15-year period, there would be a plebiscite, and that plebiscite vote ultimately sent the Saar territory back to Germany. But during that 15-year period, there is material out there that is representative of the League activities. So if you look, this cover in the upper left-hand corner, it's from the League of Nations. It was sent to the administration. So again, looking at who it's addressed to is important. So this is indicative that there was a commission in the Saar at the time. The cover on the upper right is interesting. It's actually from the Italian police force that was dispatched to the Saar right before the plebiscite. And if you will, this was actually one of the first international peacekeeping operations ever to be recorded. So during that plebiscite, there were 4 different contingents that were sent by the League of Nations to the area. They were from Great Britain, from Italy, from Sweden, and from the Netherlands. Each of those contingents had their own cancellations that are collectible. Lower left-hand corner, again, we have a nice pre-printed corner card for the commission in the Saar territory. And then finally, in the lower right, we have a nice League of Nations corner card for the League of Nations Commission as well. Again, there are one of the most interesting areas, I think, for League of Nations is this little area called Leticia, which was between Colombia and Peru. And back in 1932, Peru had invaded this little area of Colombia. Oh, I keep doing that, I'm sorry. And as a result of the conflict, they went to the League of Nations and asked that the issue be resolved by the League of Nations. So during that year, the League of Nations actually set up a commission in that little area of Leticia. That commission promoted health. They set up some schools and hospitals. So they really did some fabulous things for the little Leticia area. And we do have some interesting postal history that's come out over the years. And I'll point you to a book that was recently written by a friend of mine, and many of you may know Fran Adams. It's called The Leticia Incident, and it's available on Amazon Books. And Fran goes into a wonderful history about this area. He's done some exhibiting, and he does a census of all the material that's known, all the cancellations and auxiliary marks, etc. So in Fran's book, we know of approximately 26 covers from this Leticia. This one in the upper right-hand corner is actually being dispatched from the commission. So it's an outbound cover. The cover in the bottom is actually from the League of Nations inbound to the commission at Leticia. And if you look, you can see a lot of auxiliary marks and cancellations. I won't go into the details because of the time, but they make for a very fascinating study. Finally, this sort of gets us to the point where the League of Nations really started to fail. And it sort of, some issues that were brought up to the League of Nations that weren't resolved. They didn't really exercise that collective security guarantee that was promoted back at Versailles. And one I'll just point out was when Italy had occupied Abyssinia, which is now Ethiopia, back in the early 1930s. Emperor Haile Selassie actually made the trek to Geneva, and he discussed the plight of his country in front of the League of Nations. Unfortunately, the League didn't really respond in any authoritative manner to stop the aggression. And that was probably the first nail in the coffin for the League of Nations. Here is a nice little cover from an Italian military personnel while they were in Ethiopia later in about 1936. So what happened? Obviously, Germany invaded Poland in 1939, and all things started to unravel. So the League of Nations, being in Geneva, was surrounded by some of the Axis powers. And so mail emanating from Geneva often ran into difficulty being delivered. So this first cover here, you'll notice there's a auxiliary mark here for a return to sender. And that mark was applied because this cover was on its way north of Switzerland, was stopped at the border and never delivered. Interesting enough, the cover on the bottom here, I find extremely interesting. It was actually posted in 1940. It was sent on its way to Great Britain through France, and at some point through its transfer into France, it was stopped. And it was held in France for nearly 5 years before it was resent on its journey. And so you can see it was received in 1945, although it had been postmarked in 1940. And there was a nice auxiliary mark here that says it was detained in France during the occupation. So how did the League deal with the war and the problems getting mail out of Geneva? Well, one of the things they did is they looked for alternate routes. So typically for airmail services, there were 3 main routes that were used. One was from Geneva through France to Lisbon, and then onward by air or ship out of Lisbon, depending on the destination. So the cover up top here is one that is indicative of that route from Geneva. And it's got the registry label. It's got some very high denomination issues because of certainly the weight, 98 grams, and where it was headed. It was headed to our friend Renborg in Washington. The second cover here, it was used the Basel, Frankfurt, Lisbon trail. And how do we know that that's the way this particular cover went? Well, if you look closely, you will see that there is a wax pencil manuscript on this particular cover that says Bale 2, which is indicative of that Basel location. And then finally, there was a third southern route from Chiasso through Rome and then on to Lisbon and then forwarded beyond there. And again, similar to the Basel one, we know this has gone this particular route, again, from the wax pencil manuscript Chiasso 2 that's represented here on the cover. So one of the other things the League of Nations did and the ILO did to deal with the squeezing of the axis around the country was to actually relocate the organization itself. And so portions of the League of Nations Secretariat actually moved to the United States. The majority of the ILO actually moved to Canada, and several of the League and the Refugee Organization, as I had mentioned earlier, moved to Great Britain. And we do have representative examples of philatelic material that show this. So in the upper right-hand corner, you'll see the ILO cover with a pre-printed corner card from Montreal too. And the ILO, when it went to Canada, ended up going to McGill University in Montreal. And the covers from about 1940, 41 through 46 would be indicative of that period when they were in Montreal. In the lower left-hand corner, we have the reverse of a nice little airmail envelope. And you'll notice the purple rubber stamp imprint for the League of Nations Treasury at Hyde Park in London. This is, to date, this is a unique imprint. We've only seen one example of it, but it is certainly representative that the League of Nations Treasury was actually in Great Britain at the time. And then finally, this beautiful little wrapper on the bottom with a pre-printed corner card or addressee from the League of Nations mission at Princeton New Jersey. Now, they weren't actually on Princeton University ground, but they were very close adjacent to Princeton University. So what happened after World War II? Well, in April of 45, a very special conference, the United Nations Conference on International Organization, convened in San Francisco, California. And there's a lot of philatelic and material associated with that conference. First day covers, Cinderellas. Here's an example of a nice perforated Cinderella honoring the conference. And to the right is a beautiful first day cover hand-drawn by Dorothy Knapp for commemorating the conference with the Towards United Nations commemorative stamp, first day canceled there in San Francisco. Now, the first General Assembly for the League happened in January of 1946. And if you look at the lower left-hand corner, the British Post Office had developed a special commemorative slogan cancellation that says United Nations London 45. That cancellation went into service on December 1st of 45, and it was remained in service in all of the London postal facilities through around January 24th, I think, of 46. Although some of the post office held over that cancel for a little while, so some of them are known into February of 46 as well. Before the General Assembly actually convened, they sent over a preparatory commission. And here's a nice little cover that shows that the preparatory commission was actually in London at Dean's Yard at Church House. We're almost done. How are we doing on time, Yamil? Okay? Okay. We're good? Okay. In April of 1946, the League of Nations convened its final General Assembly conference. And between April of 1946 and April of 1947, approximately a year, League of Nations stamps were still available and valid for use. Now, what makes it interesting during this transition period is we'll often see, for example, in the upper left-hand corner, a League of Nations stamp, but it is tied to the piece by a United Nations circular date stamp. And that United Nations date stamp started on January 2nd of 1947 was the first day of usage of that date stamp. So for about 3 months, 4 months, you could possibly find this sort of combination of a league stamp with a Nation Unie circular date stamp. If you go down to the bottom right, you'll notice there's a nice little United Nations service cover. But if you look closely, the stamps themselves are League of Nations stamps. And the cancellation here is actually a Société des Nations cancellation. So although the United Nations existed at the time, they were still using some of that new United Nations stationery for purposes out of the UN offices in Geneva, and the PTT and office in Geneva still was using the Société des Nations circular date stamp. If you go to the upper right-hand corner, you see a really interesting cover with a League of Nations corner card in Spanish that's been eradicated, covered up, and it's been overprinted for the World Health Organization, which is one of the organizations of the United Nations. The stamps themselves are World Health stamps, and the special circular date stamp is for the World Health Organization. This particular cover, as you can see, went to China, so it's quite an interesting destination. And finally, in the lower left-hand corner, I really like this cover. The first temporary headquarters for the United Nations was at Hunter College in the Bronx, New York. And they were there during the summer of 1946. And they had to leave Hunter College because the school was going to reconvene in the fall, and basically they were kicked out. So for a short period of time, the UN was actually at Hunter College, as indicated by the corner card. And this particular envelope was sent to the League of Nations Economic, Financial, and Transit Division at Princeton. So it shows that the League of Nations was still active while the United Nations was getting its feet on the ground. Finally, the final slide is the demise of the League of Nations. As we mentioned, in April of 46, there was the final League of Nations Assembly. All of the assets of the League of Nations were given to the United Nations at that point, including the Palais De Nacion, which today is the United Nations office at Geneva. Here are two nice examples from that final conference. The first on the upper cover is a official service cover from a representative at the conference with a special circular date stamp for the 1946 conference. And it was sent to the chief of the United Nations Refugee Relief Administration, UNRWA. The bottom cover is a nice commemorative cover somebody drew. And you'll notice the black border, which is typical of a mourning cover. So somebody was obviously mourning the demise of the League of Nations. And again, it has the Special Assembly cancellation present. And if you look very closely at the design, there is a gentleman who is letting these doves of peace, if you will, fly. And on the doves of peace, there is a little male, and on that male it says UNO for the United Nations Organization. So with the demise of the League of Nations, there's birth, and the United Nations is now taking flight as the new international organization. Okay, I think that's it. Yes, that's the end. I'll just show you some colorful ephemera. There are lots and lots of political postcards that exist representing membership in the League of Nations or the desire to join the League of Nations. I've never seen a postcard that says anything negative about the League of Nations, but I have seen many caricatures and cartoons from the period when the League was in existence that were both positive and many that were negative as well. So I hope I haven't run too far over the time, but I do appreciate everybody listening, and thank you.
Thank you very much, Greg. Your timing was perfect. Let me start with a few questions. We have a few minutes for that. Now, in the beginning, you showed a cover with a free franking. Who had free franking privileges at the very first conference after the war in France?
Let me get back to that.
I thought he had a French cachet.
Was it?
Was it only available for French officials, or did anyone else have the free franking? Keep going
Oh,
back.
this one here.
That one there.
Yeah, this was an Italian delegate.
So,
I do not know if all of the delegations actually had free franking privileges. Most of the covers I've seen from here, I would argue are probably more philatelic than service. This one in particular was truly a service cover, so that may have been why they had the free franking privilege.
I see. At the time that the overprinted stamps were in use for both the League of Nations and the International Court of Justice, could regular non-overprinted stamps be used as well?
Yes, and typically you will see on occasion official League of Nations covers with just normal Swiss issues. And there really would be two reasons for that. One is either they ran out of the particular denominations of the overprinted issues, or it was for personal use. As I mentioned, when the Swiss PTT provided the League with the overprints, they made it very clear that it was only for official use only. So if I was a member of the League of Nations and I was just paying a bill or sending a friend a note, I could not use those overprinted stamps. So I would have to use just a normal Swiss issue.
I see. And are there any known combination uses of overprinted and non-overprinted stamps on the same cover?
I would argue that yes, I do know of some, yes. Now, why they exist, again, I would surmise the ones I have seen are usually pretty high denomination, high rate, and I would surmise that the overprinted issue simply was not available at that point in time, and so they had to resort to just using a non-overprinted stamp. I have also seen, and it's not common whatsoever, but I have seen combinations of League and ILO stamps used in combination on a cover.
And are these overprinted stamps listed in the Scott catalog?
I'm a Zumstein guy, so I couldn't tell you if I don't know. I assume they are. I mean, they're considered back of the book, but they're popular enough that I believe that they are listed. But certainly Zumstein has them listed. The European catalogs all have them listed.
Are there any forgeries of the overprinted stamps, and
yes.
are they difficult to identify?
Well, yes. Some are very, very good. As a matter of fact, if you're a member of the AHPS, I think maybe this fall or winter, there'll be an article in the Tell Journal on the first League of Nations overprint forgeries that I've just sent to Dick recently, I think. And I've identified about 8 different overprint forgery types, and there's some subtypes within there. So some of them are very good, and some of them are clearly, it would take no effort whatsoever to realize that they're fake. Now, interesting enough, I've never seen a fake stamp, League of Nations stamp, used on a cover, on a service cover. I have seen fake service covers using real League of Nations stamps and fake circular date stamps, fake Geneva 1 SDN date stamps. And the rates that they applied to them were not sufficient or proper for the addressee.
I see. Now, a non-philatelic question. What did the Refugee Commission do with those refugees who did not want to go back or repatriated or could not be repatriated?
Well, I guess it depends on what region of the world we're speaking about, but there were refugee camps on the borders of like many of the countries, and unfortunately they were interned in these refugee camps for a long time until the host nations on those borders were willing to take them in. Otherwise, they were either repatriated back to their original homes, and if that was impossible, somehow they were repatriated to another country that was willing to accept them.
I see. Now, are there any recent stamps commemorating the League of Nations, and do you collect them?
I have not collected them yet. I only know of one stamp that I had seen that was honoring the League of Nations. It struck me. I thought in 2020 there would be a lot of UPU member nations perhaps issuing commemoratives for that, but I have not really looked that hard, and I have not seen many.
I see. And one of the attendees is asking, you show a cover to China. Which of the Chinas did it go to? Do you know?
The unrecover? Which cover do we?
One of the covers addressed to China.
Let me see. I hate to scroll this quickly, but
yeah,
I think there's at the end there was an unrecover that this one here.
Yeah, we don't see it now, but you can tell us if.
Oh, okay. It's to the a gentleman named J.B. Peterson, Chief Medical Officer at the China Mission in Wangpo Road. And unfortunately, I cannot read.
Shanghai. I thought it was Shanghai.
Shanghai, yes, Shanghai, China.
I see. And are you aware of any cachets used by the India delegation in the Versailles conference?
I do not have any myself, but I'll tell you one of the best places to look. There's a wonderful conference study that was done by a friend of mine, Blanton Clement Jr., who's also a member of the United Nations Club. And it's on our website, unpi.com, under the special projects tab. And it's on all the conferences for both the League of Nations, ILO, as well as all of the United Nations agencies. It's a monumental piece of work. And I would say if something exists, it would probably be in that catalog.
I see. And lastly, you show beautiful illustrated postcards. One of them by a German tribute postcard with people dancing in a circle. Are there any other cards designed by the same artist? Are they different models or different styles that you're aware of?
Oh, well, yeah, that what I showed there is just, a few covers basically promoting the League of Nations, but I do also collect postcards related to the League of Nations. And as I said, the League itself issued a series of postcards, probably 8 or 10 groups or series, and each of those had 10 or 20 cards in each of the series. But there's also a lot of independent companies like maybe bubblegum cards or other playing card type printers that actually developed League of Nations related postcards for any